Welcome to Charity Therapy, a podcast from Birkin Law about building better nonprofits. I'm your host, Jess Birkin. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Charity Therapy. Today, I am joined by Rickesh Lakhani. Rickesh is the Executive Director of Future Possibilities for Kids, and in my experience, an amazing conversation starter about all things nonprofit on Twitter. Rickesh, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Jess. I think it's an excellent podcast, and I'm really honored to be part of it.
Oh, you're too kind. Thank you. I really wanted to have you on the podcast because, like I said, you are just always on fire on Twitter, and you're often calling out some of the just sort of BS we see in the nonprofit world. Because as much good work as is done, we're far from perfect in our industry, right? So, being an executive director and sort of being aware of the nonprofit sector's sort of issues, I'm wondering, what would you say is the most important way that you try to cultivate a healthy culture when you're leading an organization?
To me, one of the most important things is trust. You have to show your team, your colleagues, that you care about them, and not just through your words, but through your actions. You have to show that you have their back, even when that means you have to challenge those with power to demonstrate that if it's a donor or it's a board member, you have to show them that you have their back, and have a clear and shared understanding of how people will treat each other, what behavior is rewarded, and what will also be called out and not accepted, being as transparent as possible. Those are some of the facets of how I like to lead.
I love that. Okay. Now, I've got some questions for you here from folks who maybe don't have as great an executive director as you. Are you ready to field some of those?
Let's go for it. Yeah.
All right, here we go. Our first question. In my experience, working at a nonprofit usually comes with wearing multiple hats and doing lots of weird work. I've always been pretty bad at protecting myself from wearing too many hats. Whether for better or worse, I've become known within my organization as someone who gets things done. Because of that reputation, naturally, I'm in a situation now where I'm doing another department's work for them. I was instructed to do the task by my boss, but now my own job responsibilities are suffering and falling by the wayside. Another different department also found a way to make me indefinitely responsible for a task they used to fulfill recently. How can I prevent job creep like this?
Yeah, that is fairly common. Sometimes we hear, Jess. That saying that if you want to find someone to give the work to, find the person who's the busiest, right? That's that perpetual motion machine that we see. So, we have this thing in the social good space too, where because of the good work we're doing, we overextend and we give just that little bit more. But that can be dangerous for our own well-being. I do have to say, I do have a bias typically, though, against general pushback on when people say, that's not in my job description. I do think
Right.
we should be willing to work together to support the cause, but it should not come at the expense of any person getting sort of burned out or not being able to have and express boundaries. Perhaps asking the manager to clarify, what is expected, and identifying that when something else is added, it's challenging to maintain a high level of quality if there are just too many things on your plate. The issue is that, if an org is not conducive to sort of hearing you out, then, it may run into issues, but that's a really good place to start. It's just seeking that clarity and expressing what you're feeling.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. The first thing that I'm noticing is their boss did tell them to do this. And so that's key in my mind. I think we've all worked in situations where there's somebody who kind of hoards the work and takes on too much responsibility, and nobody was asking them to do that. So at least in this case, their boss is asking them to take on this responsibility. So it's completely fair for them to sit down with their manager and say, I'm excited about this. I can do this. I'm really worried that when it comes to my performance review, that I'm going to get poor marks on these other things because these are sliding. And I just want to have a real open conversation with you about how do I prioritize my work? Because there's only so much time in a day. And, the manager may not realize that it's not possible to get all the things done, right? Especially if they're the kind of person that's a workaholic or is putting in 10-hour days. That kind of gets into another issue about what the org culture is like. But keeping those lines of communication open is the biggest key here, and sort of managing up in a way to say, hey, I want to make sure that like I'm supporting you and supporting the team, but I'm also like legitimately worried about my own review. Is, what manager can be upset with you for taking that tack? And I do think there is like an element in I identify with this in myself anyway, where people who are naturally helpers can sort of tend to also be the people who overgive and feel overly responsible. And I think a lot of us are drawn to the nonprofit sector or to helping industries because we have that inclination. So I would just caution this person to really be careful with not overgiving to the point that you're so burned out you can't take care of yourself, like even just at home. So boundaries are super important when you're in a service or helping profession. Absolutely.
Mhm. Boundaries are key. And hopefully, again, you're in a place where, as you said, the first question, going back to culture, is that you are able to have and able to express those boundaries and have that be respected. Because when we talk about some of the conversations we're having, we're talking about a healthy culture. But in an unhealthy culture, things you can do that rationally make sense will actually not be received the way you thought. You need to have that support of management and at work that will
Yeah,
be conducive to that.
absolutely. All right, let's go to our second question. I'm a philanthropy coordinator for a large hospital foundation. I really like my job and I can see a future for myself within this organization. The only thing, which is even weird to say as a negative, is that my coworkers are really into their jobs, as in constantly working weekends, evenings, and voluntarily always taking on new projects even when they are swamped, volunteering at the hospital whenever they're asked, etc. I value my work, but I try to never work late. I always take my lunch break. I never work on weekends, and I usually decline to take on a bunch of extra volunteer work within the organization. I work to live, not live to work. My coworkers seem like 99% of them live to work. How do I maintain my boundaries in this kind of environment? I don't want to be seen as doing the bare minimum for only doing the work I'm actually being compensated for. Yay.
Yikes. Yeah. Wow. But I think we're both kind of chuckling because we know that, again, this is like very real. Like when I hear that, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I've seen this play out. I've had people describe similar situations to me. So I will respond to the direct question, but I think I'm also speaking directly to management and leaders to say, these are your folks. These are folks that clearly care about their work and clearly want to do well, but are trying to establish boundaries. We've talked about like the great resignation recently, but it's actually the great reset is people redefining their relationship with work. So first of all, I will say congratulations to this person for actually having this boundary and being able to sort of stick with it. I wish that more of us, including myself, were able to do this. But the issue that they've identified is that it seems to be, it's a culture that rewards burnout and a lack of boundaries. So I would suggest this person to keep reminding themselves what's important to them, telling themselves that in order to take care of to care about the cause, that they do have to take care of themselves, something you alluded to earlier. And when they feel like maybe they're not doing enough, just ask themselves what would happen if they were to give more of themselves. What would that look like to the balance that they've established? So just stay close to what's important to them, and that separation piece sounds like it is, because it's so easy to probably get caught up in that. A lot of this is about just seeking clarity from the manager's leadership. But to say, it's very important for me to be in good, mental health to be able to fulfill my work and do it well. How do you feel about my contributions to the organization? And maybe the managers feel like, oh no, you're doing great, like it's awesome. But I see it happens in these cultures though is that promotions, opportunities, raises, unfortunately go to people who are willing to sacrifice themselves. And this person does not want that to be them, which is good. But I think that again, level setting conversation, that reminders to themselves they're doing what they know works for them is going to be critical here.
Yeah, this one is really almost like the opposite of the other one, because the last question, it's extra duties as assigned, but the boss actually asks you to do it. And this one, it's like it's just implied that the expectation is that you're available 24/7. And this is, for me, a much more dangerous situation as the employee, right? There's this great book by Morgan called Images of Organizations, and it's all about the different kinds of organizational cultures. And there's like one style where it's like, oh, everyone's a family, but it's like a big dysfunctional family. And so they talk about, everything happens at the organization. All birthdays are celebrated at the organization, all holiday, it's just like, it's very like they're sucking you in. If you think of Google and these big tech companies that are offering all the perks, or this is with law firms too, right? Like, well, we have on-site catered meals and we'll do your dry cleaning for you. It's so that you'll stay in the building longer so you don't have to leave. And it's really unhealthy. This is one where I'm sort of like, yes, I agree. Check in with your manager, make sure that your supervisor thinks that you're on track and doing a good job. But culture is like the slowest moving thing. It's deeply ingrained. It's in all the little corners and in all the little like unspoken things. And this isn't something this person's going to be able to change. So if this is the way it is at their organization and they don't want to be that way, and hats off to you, because like this is dysfunctional. Probably the move is going to be, at what point can you start looking for another gig, because you're probably not going to get promoted and you're probably going to feel uncomfortable the entire time you're working there, trying to maintain your very reasonable work-life boundaries. I mean, even just like at my firm here, like we're working with a ton of volunteers. And when do volunteers do their stuff? Nights and weekends. Does that mean that I expect my staff to answer their email nights and weekends? No, because they're working so hard all day long that I specifically tell them, do not respond. Like, just turn off your notifications. I don't even want you to see the envelope with the number. Just don't do it, because it is so important to have those work-life boundaries. And you're absolutely right. Like, anybody that's a manager that's listening right now, trust me, people are looking for better work environments. And if your work environment is not respecting that people are whole humans, like, that's a problem. You're going to start draining the talent right out of your organization.
We've seen that happening, and we've seen people leaving roles. I mean, I know within our own organization, I repeatedly tell the board that we can do whatever strategic pieces we want, but resources adequately, because we're not having this on the backs of the staff. So like that has to come from the leadership, the board. Everyone has to understand that a goal of success strategically is staff being in a good place. So we've been implementing more pieces to create balance, especially when we switch to a remote work environment, which we're staying with now because everyone is on board with it, is making those actually as strategic goals of the organization, not just programming or fundraising or what have you, or reach. It's also, how are the staff doing? And so, I mean, a lot of the changes recently, we've in the last 18 months had 0% turnover on staff, and we actually have increased our employee engagement scores on our anonymous survey that we do through the pandemic, because it's been focused on the people. It does work when you do it and you really mean it. And we're not, hey, you work 50 hours, like, oh, that's good, like, let me kind of compete with you. It's like, oh no, wait, you're 50 hours, like, let's talk about what's going on in your workload. Like, what do we need to do here to balance that out? Because it's not going to work, right? We have to proactively address this and identify it and see, hey, you got too much going on. Let's talk about this. Is this a temporary thing, or does this keep happening because we can't sustain this? You won't be able to sustain this.
Yes, this is why you are a great boss.
Try my best. Just trying. Can I share one more thing before we move on to the next one? Is Kashana Palmer, who is absolutely brilliant. Please find Kashana talking about a lot of these pieces. And I remember one time being at a presentation, and Kashana said that she talked about boundaries and guardrails. So boundaries are what you set for yourself, and guardrails are what the organization sets for you. Because we can tell people, oh, like, don't work so many hours and make sure you take time off and all that. But the guardrails are, this is the maximum number of hours, or we're mandating time off, or we're reshifting workloads. Like, that is, the organization can do it, because sometimes people aren't necessarily good at keeping their boundaries because they believe that, they should be doing more. So that's that. I bet that distinction has always been so powerful for me.
Yeah, 100%. I have a great example of this just from my own team. Like, I basically offer unlimited time off. I think the whole, like, you work 8 hours, you accrue like 15 minutes, that whole system is just baloney. Like, we're all adults. Like, as long as you're hitting your targets, you should be able to take time off whenever you need it. Having been a mom and raised small children, and like knowing what it's like to have the call from daycare and not having enough PTO and going into the negative, like, all of that is just horrible. It's like, we're a team, like let's support each other, let's plan our time off, but like you can take what you want. But I actually have a minimum amount of days off. You must take at least 10 days off per calendar year, because my concern with unlimited PTO is that culturally we tend to not take PTO. And if I hire people that are like driven and hard workers, and then they're just not going to take the time off. So I actually make them I like check in every quarter, like, are you on track? When's the last time you took some time off? That is a great example of like setting up a guardrail. I love it so much. All right, here we go. Last question. I work at a large foundation and I'm really struggling. I came to the foundation after working a number of years in the private sector for F100 companies where I had nothing but positive experiences and great managers. As a Black woman, I would have never expected to experience so much BS, microaggressions, and dismissiveness from people who are supposedly out to save the world. The foundation is full of arrogant white people who think they're the smartest in the room, and it seems like the main goal is stroking their egos, not fulfilling our mission. The culture is also very much conformist. Quote, it's the way we've always done it, unquote, and go along just to get along. So far, I've been outspoken and tried to change the culture of the org for better, but I'm getting nowhere. Is this a lost cause, or is there something more I should be doing here? Oh my God, I love this question so much. This is so like honest and true and vulnerable. It's really a good one.
Yes, thank you to this listener for putting themselves out there and sharing this. Again, unfortunately, not an uncommon experience. There's a couple of components here. One is the issue of, how your identity, plays into your role. So, for example, navigating the space as, let's say, a Black woman. Obviously, I can't speak to that, but I know that Collecting Courage is a book that was released a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, and it's a collection of 15 Black fundraisers in Canada and the U.S. primarily sharing their stories of their experiences in this so-called social good space. And it's absolutely, you see that these things are happening and running rampant here, and it's causing folks to, again, great, wonderful, brilliant folks to leave the space because of it. So, I mean, in terms of the microaggressions and dismissiveness and all those pieces, I mean, it does exist here, and there's a lot of work still to be done. I'm trying to stay hopeful as much as I can on that component. But I think that also goes hand in hand with the other piece around being conformist. That's the way we've always done it. Those two things are not surgically removed from each other. They're actually very much related to each other, because normally the systems that are the way that people are currently doing things benefits a select group of people who can hold that power and can continue sitting in their seats, even though they're not necessarily, doing right by the staff or the community. And so I think that this person is very, brave for speaking up and doing what they can. I mean, to me, that's the way we've always done it. Is like one of my number one red flags, because it indicates a culture which is rigid and not sort of open to change. So good for them for speaking out, but we also have to remind ourselves that speaking out may come at a cost, and especially depending on your identity. I would have, again, clear, direct, seems to be the theme here, clear, direct conversations with leadership and management about the issues, about the impact it has on this person and others, explore what's possible together, make suggestions, demonstrate success of any initiatives that have been put in place. This is another critical one, and I will speak to leadership and management. If leadership and management are not on board with this, like, again, it's going to be going, against a brick wall, because they need to be players at the table here. Otherwise, it's not going to move the culture forward. So, kudos to this person, but it's also possible that being someone who's vocal against a very resistant culture will actually have you actively sabotaged and pushed out too. So I'm again, hoping that's not what happens here, but it's a possibility we've seen happen.
It's definitely a possibility. And, you nailed it, that the way we've always done it, what's funny is like, I can think of organizational leadership that I, worked with for a long time and would watch them say that they valued, change and innovation. And the worst thing you could do is say, well, this is how we're doing it because this is the way we've always done it. And then in the same breath, they would turn around and knock down anything that was like too change oriented. So words are cheap. Ugh. The struggle in my mind is like, these things won't change unless people speak out, but also, do you want to be the sacrificial lamb knowing that it's probably a drop in the bucket and a whole lot of other people are also going to need to speak out, and that this could sort of tank your career permanently or temporarily. Um, that's always the struggle for me in these situations, right? It's like, do you speak up? Do you not speak up and just move on? It's like, well, I know you say you can see yourself here, but unless you can really build a strategic alliance of many people who also want to speak out, I worry that it's not really worth it on an individual level. Is it important to, well, the industry? Yes, but like, you got to buy groceries tomorrow, you know?
Yeah, that you've identified the dynamic that plays out a lot. That should I speak up and potentially lose my job for this, or get pushed aside, or stay quiet and everything continues. And again, that's why people are having such a struggle within organizations that are like as the one that this listener described. And that's why I do sort of share as much as I can publicly my learning journey, as well as the things that I think are important, because I want people to know that you're not alone. There are places that will value you, that will treat you the way that you deserve to be treated, and you just have to keep hoping that they're out there. But also, what can we each of us do, whatever role we're in? But I am, again, speaking primarily to boards and CEOs and EDs, to say you're the primary person who can really make a difference. You're literally impacting the livelihood and well-being of so many people, and what you do with that role, that seat, is so critical. And so these experiences here are being faced by a lot of folks who won't say anything and will just suffer in silence, and it's horrible, and I understand why they do that as well. I just wish it was, as you're right, it's completely unfair. So again, my sights are set on the powers that be to say you need to do something, and we need to also, as a whole, as a sector, band together and say, we're not taking this, and we're not going to accept this, and we're not going to be part of it. And I think people hopefully will listen more.
Yeah, I love that. So, wow, I've like got so many takeaways here. This has been just massive stuff. So first, just sort of like, it's so important to develop trust with your team. Talk is cheap. How you're acting is really important. And then second, having clear, direct, open lines of communication. And even if your staff, trying to open those up or keeping those open with your direct supervisors is really critical to protecting yourself in a boundaried way, in a healthy boundaried way. Then I just would say, pay attention as you are in a job or when you're interviewing for a job, and look for signs of healthy culture and unhealthy culture. Culture is often unspoken, and it's hard to identify those things. If you're really into this, I would say read that Images of Organizations book, so you can start to pick out what are the hallmarks of different organizational cultures. And then fourth, I've got, working at a nonprofit is not a guarantee that the workplace is a good place. And that is a sad reality for a lot of folks when they have dedicated themselves to an organization to sort of come up to that real conclusion. And that leads into number 5, which is don't sacrifice yourself for a nonprofit. There is no mission that's worth sacrificing your whole career or life. It's okay to move on when you need to move on. And then I think my last one for leadership is, if someone says about your organizational culture makes you upset, really take 3 or 4 days to allow those feelings to percolate and really think through why it's upsetting to you, and get to the bottom of how you might accept some of the responsibility and what you can do to address it. Because a lot of times when we have a strong reaction, that's our emotional defensive response, and we need some time to really process what's actually going on, and acting from a more stable, calm, I have processed this and taken time to think about the risk that this person took to say these things is often a lot better than just striking out.
Yeah, covered a lot of ground there. That's an amazing summary. That's a superpower you have, to be able to talk at the same time as kind of putting all those things down. That's pretty incredible.
Hashtag lawyer skills.
Yeah, that's for real. That's amazing. So that's pretty credible. And I think you said a lot of good things there. There's nothing I would add to that. I think you've really covered it.
I mean, like, just basically get the transcript of this episode and listen to everything Rickesh said and like implement it at your organization. Rickesh, thank you so much for being here. If listeners want to connect with you, where's the best place for them to find you and learn more about you?
Yeah, I mean, definitely you can connect on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. My tag is @ConstantChanges, which is especially the last couple of years, has been very pertinent. And also, I'm experimenting with TikTok. I'm very amateur, but I'm called Charity Dad on TikTok. So if you want to see some very amateur, fun TikToks, then check me out there.
I love that. Okay, I'm picturing you like dancing now, and I'm going to totes have to go check out your TikToks.
There's a little bit of dancing there.
I mean, it's TikTok.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Folks, if you enjoyed this episode, do me a huge favor. Share it with a friend, rate, review, subscribe on your podcast app. It really does help me out. If you have a question or a story to share, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a note online or leave a voice memo by calling 612-208-9120. Thanks for listening.
All right, folks, that's our show. Be sure to follow me on Instagram or Twitter @JessBirkin. We want to hear from you. Send us a message at our website, charitytherapy.show. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at birkinlaw.com/signup. Charity Therapy is a production of Birkin Law Office, PLLC. Our theme song is by Whalehawk. And remember, folks, this podcast is produced for your entertainment and is not a substitute for actual legal advice.